We can now bring in Marco Vincenzo, Director of Global Strategy Project, who joins us from Washington. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today. India didn't want the conflict in Ukraine to overshadow the summit, but it seems to have done so anyways, given that there was no joint communique reached.
I mean, just a broad statement at the end. This was similar also to other meetings, some recent meetings in the past, whereby at summits there would be no joint communique. Listen, it's inevitable. The conflict in Ukraine has impacted everyone, the global economy, in terms of whether it's food prices, energy prices, in addition to other factors, not just the Ukraine war alone, but the Ukraine war plays a big role in further destabilizing the world. So at these joint, this is not just a G20 meeting. There's also 20 other non-G20 governments that were invited. So we're looking at more or less a total of 40 countries with 40 foreign ministers. So the global implications of the war of Ukraine will inevitably impact any kind of summit that involves several countries from around the world, particularly the larger economies.
Given that the war in Ukraine has had an impact on, as you said, food prices, energy prices, these obviously impact developing economies the most, economies in the global south. How is it then that countries in the global south haven't been swayed by the West, if you will, when it comes to standing up to Russia?
Listen, many of these countries in the South, what's called the global South, many of them rely or depend upon Russia for several resources. If you look at the host nation of this G20 meeting of foreign ministers, India alone purchases enormous amounts of energy. It's reliable to a large extent on Russia for its energy supplies, also for certain food supplies, for arms. For example, India has its borders with Pakistan and China that it has to defend. Much of that is done with Russian arms. So as a result, a country like India, the host nation of this G20 summit, has to be very carefully. Other countries, same thing. Africa in particular, countries that rely on Russia for food-related materials. So this is not just about ideals, about freedom. It's many in the outside world, outside Europe, see this Ukraine conflict as a European war, not so much as something that involves them. They have their national interests at stake. So this conflict, the fallout of the Ukraine war, you have several levels to it. What people are saying, there's several blocks. You have three blocks. You have sort of the free world bloc, which is the U.S. and its allies. You have what you call the bloc of revisionist autocracies, would be countries like China and Russia. And then you have a third large bloc, which are the non-aligned movement, the countries such as India, the host nation of this G20 Foreign Ministers Summit.
Now, we have reports that Anthony Blinken met on the sidelines of this summit with Sergei Lavrov. The Russians, of course, want to downplay that meeting, saying Lavrov spoke to Blinken while walking. What do you make of this sort of the fact that the two men are speaking?
If you're physically present in the same room, at some point you may run into contact. They're not strangers. They know each other fairly well. When Biden visited Kiev, it took weeks, not months, to arrange that visit to Kiev. And that was obviously done in coordination with the Russians for the security of the U.S. president. So there is a dialogue that's ongoing behind the scenes. The idea is that no one wants to be seen in public as speaking or having any kind of dialogue because it can have negative repercussions back at home politically.
Given that this G20 foreign ministers meeting ended without a communique due to divisions which exist over Ukraine, do you foresee that this is going to continue going forward as long as there's this sort of quasi-stalemate in Ukraine when it comes to between the West and the global South?
Prior to this foreign ministers G20 meeting, there was a meeting of finance ministers and had a similar conclusion. As long as this war goes on, you're going to see more or less continuity in these type of arrangements or these kind of ends of summits ending like this. So I really see for the foreseeable future, I see continuity in such outcomes, in such summits.
Do you think that's due to the reluctance of the West to pursue dialogue when it comes to ending the war? Because we did see China come out with that 12-point peace plan last Friday, which was rejected by NATO, which was rejected by most Western countries, but it wasn't rejected by Ukraine, even though it didn't call for Russian troops to leave Ukraine's territory.
Listen, any kind of dialogue, particularly if you look at second largest economy in the world like China, Ukraine wouldn't reject it because ultimately Ukraine knows at some stage down the road it's going to have to deal with China economically in some way. So it doesn't want to do an outright rejection of it. But the reality is that China is struggling right now, although it kind of gave its passive acquiescence to the Russian invasion on February 24th of 2022. The reality, it thought that Russia would just quickly end the war. The reality, it's become somewhat of a nightmare for China itself, because the longer this war goes on, the worse it is for China and its economy and its relationships diplomatically around the world.
But for the French president got a lot of flack when he said Russia, Vladimir Putin shouldn't be embarrassed and that Moscow should be given an off-ramp.
Yeah, I mean, that's rhetoric, and that's within the Western alliance. There's been a bit of past year is that turn the volume accordingly. What he's trying to do is saying that this whole conflict, is important to give Russia some kind of graceful saving face exit from it. But the longer this war goes on, the more complicated it gets, and it will get worse this year. The second year just recently began, the second year of the war. Such things that you described as, Macron's statements, that they will become less and less relevant, realizing that there's no end in sight so far for this war. It's only going to get worse.
Marco Vincenzo, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on the program today.
Thank you.
The French President Emmanuel Macron